I had a friend, a professor who was a friend of mine, who I went to a talk of his, and something happened to me at a talk where I realized I wanted to write essays. This was and what I mean by that, I mean personal narrative essays where I wanted, it's sort of like memoir, but it wasn't exactly memoir because, but I knew I wanted to write something. And I had been writing poetry up until that point. I hadn't really had that impulse. And I had been working at the prison. And one day I sat down, or one night, I can't remember, and I just started writing. And this was before I had my little Apple computer. This was all by hand. And I wrote and wrote and wrote. And it turned out I was writing about being in the prison, connected something with my mother's death, because in the prison, the women had a almost like a not a not a ceremony, but they had some way in which they honored me when my mother died, which was a phenomenal experience. So my work in the prison and my mother's death got kind of linked together, and that started me writing. And I wrote and wrote. And then the first thing I did, I wrote this ridiculously long article and had some connections and got the Boston Globe magazine interested in my article. I'd published some things, but I'd never really published anything major. And they said, this is really good. There's really something here. You have to rewrite it. I rewrote it. This is really good. There's something here. You have to rewrite it. So they were very patient with me because I wasn't a writer yet. I really had to learn to be a writer. And I learned to be a writer because I had a story to tell. That's that's the most important thing about me. I became, you know, I a lot of people are writers just because they're writers. I was a writer because I had to tell a story that no one else had told. I was the first person in the United States to do Shakespeare in prison. And that not many people do it now, but I it was a phenomenal thing to tell a story of being in a prison, doing something as dramatic as a play in a prison where the person in the play has a knife and is about to kill someone. I mean, to get the pound of flesh, they think he's going to kill someone, and there's a knife in a prison, and you're in a prison, etc. So the drama of all of that, the fascination of all of that, the intensity of all of that, the loneliness of all of that, because I couldn't talk to anybody, and this is right before I met my husband. Um, my current, I was alone. I wanted to tell my story. That is what drove me to the page. I was always interested in plays that were classic texts that the women could, as I said, adapt. Um, Merchant of Venice was the first one I did. I found that when I tried to write the book the first time, I tried to write all the plays. That didn't work. So I ended up shaping the book around one play and around Merchant. And but I was able to, the time sequence was really very challenging. So I focused it, I wrote it linearly the first time. That didn't work. I ended up changing it to write it character by character, person by person. That worked much better. But I had a 2 year period. So Dolly, 2 years, Birdie, 2 years, each character, 2 years. So you're reading their arc, each person's arc. I became a fly on the wall. It really is my memoir, but it's the best kind of memoir, I think, where you're not in the picture. I love, somebody said that, make yourself a minor character in your memoir. And I did that. I was a minor character. So I wanted them to be the focus of the story, the women. I wanted their trajectory, and that's what I did. And it's still a kind of a cult book. It really was one of the first of its kind, and people read that book, Shakespeare Behind Bars. When I was writing those stories, I didn't really know how many different stories there were and how many different traumas there were, but there are so many different traumas that mothers go through. And so that the book really does show all of that without my, doing it in a didactic way. What happened was I went to a parole hearing, of which I've been to in Massachusetts. You can go to lifer parole hearings. And now I'm a prison activist, that my work in prison got me into that. So I've been to about 50 lifer parole hearings. And at one, very unusual, a mother who was the mother of the person seeking parole who had killed someone, she stood up in the hearing and asked forgiveness from the mother on the other side who was separated by a rope at the time. Now they have a little wall. And she said they had known each other as children, and her son had killed a child, somebody who who she knew. And so the mother asked forgiveness of this other mother, and the mother forgave her in the parole hearing. And it was such a phenomenal experience. I'd never seen anything like that. It was something the parole board could never have manufactured. And that again drove me to the page to write about that. Now, I wrote about it nonfiction-y, but it wasn't enough. It didn't feel enough. And somehow, right, I don't know if it was right before, no, it was 2017 or 18. I can't remember exactly when I think it might have been as far back as 2017, but I, because the parole hearing was in 2014. 2017, I think I just said, I wonder what that mother was feeling. And I started to imagine her wearing a hat, getting ready for the parole hearing. And it was that hat and that imagination of that scene that got me into writing. And I started to say, wow, mothers of children who've killed people, what do they feel? What do they think? What are they going through? And that's each mother. That's how I got my 10 mothers.